Go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight with Juliet Grames, my friend and author. She was our last, reminded me that she was our last author in the smaller bookstore right before COVID started. So after you, we probably wouldn't have had another author for at least, probably almost a year, I would imagine, because nobody was doing anything. So we're happy to have you back. When I heard about your second book, I was thrilled because I'm such a big fan of you in general. And if this wine doesn't spill, it'll be a miracle. Hold on. I got it. No, I'm good. All right. So we're very happy you're all here tonight. It wasn't last night with all the rain. We are here to talk about Juliet's second book, The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, and all of the questions that go into the books that you write, because you put so much detail and such a love for Italian history and everything you write. So the story is, a story, but the way you do your work is just exceptional. And I'm just such a big fan of you, so we could just talk about that, but we'll have you talk about your new book instead. So formally, I'm going to introduce Juliet, who is one of my very dear friends, and she's also the best-selling author of The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in Real Simple, Parade, and the Boston Globe, and she is the recipient of the Ellery Queen Award for the Mystery Writers of America. She is also the editorial director at Soho Press in New York, where she is a wonderful editor for many wonderful authors that we've all come to love. We had Eli Craner here last week, also a big fan of yours. Carol Black, I've met a million times, I love her. We had a nice moment talking about Peter Lovesey last week at our event. So Juliet has also introduced me to so many authors that I absolutely adore. So it's just been a great relationship for a really long time. So we're excited for you to talk about your new book, and we are going to have you start by, I'm just going to read the first sentence. I love the first sentence. It just, she gets right to it, as any good editor does. Hold on. You're good with not wasting words, which I love about you. My father used to tell me that growing up, hold on, I should put the glasses on. My father used to tell me that growing up meant understanding who was at fault wasn't what mattered. What mattered was who had to pay the consequences. Such a great way to open a book. Immediately dives right into the heart of it. I love that. And we are so happy you're here.
Thank you, Kelly. So I'm a huge fan of Kelly's, but you probably all are too, and that's why you're all here. She's such an amazing book advocate and such a smart and incisive reader, and we're not all here only because we're all Italian. And if there's anyone in this audience who doesn't identify as biologically Italian, I want to tell you that we're open to converts. So, anyway.
There's not enough Italians.
Totally. Yeah, so thank you for having me tonight.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the way in which writing this book came about?
So, this story of The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, it's set in 1960 in Calabria, which is the toe of the boot of Italy. And it's a region where my grandmother was born in 1920, and it's a place I'm really passionate about. So I'd done a ton of research on that area when I was writing The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. And one thing that came out during this research, which we're all Southern Italians, specifically Americans, we know that the story of our people is not very well written, right? It's ignored. People think of Florence, they think of Rome, they think of Venice. All those places are great, but the place where our people are from has historically not been talked about or written about. And so it was really hard for me to get to that information, to try to recreate what life was like there in the 20s and 30s. So I ended up doing a massive number of interviews with members of the Italian diaspora. And just, if you do identify as Italian and you want to be interviewed by me about your grandparents, just let me know, because I'm still always collecting these interviews. And that's how I tried to get to the meat of what the immigrant experience was like and what people remembered about stories they may have received from their grandparents about what life was like in the old country, etc. And so during this interview process, which for Stella included more than 100 members of this diaspora, I had one story that came up again and again and again and again and again, which was a missing relative. So like an uncle, usually in the first 2 decades of the aughts and the teens, who sailed away to America in search of opportunity and then was never heard from again. And it's just very sad and creepy and melancholy and frightening. It's all of these things, because I have this in my family, and I know my husband has this in his family. So hearing this confirmation that it occurs almost 100% of the time, I would say you may know of a story like this in your family, but you may also not know, and it might be there. It was just so dangerous to emigrate. People had, especially in those early years, there were not a lot of communities. We were talking right before about, when a grandfather would come over and stay with relatives on their couch until he got settled. In the early years, when there weren't couches to stay on, you were on your own, you might not speak English, you may or may not have the documents that allow you to get safe work. And immigrants, so often their bodies are used in brutal ways. They're coal miners, they're building railroads, they're digging ditches, my grandfather built a sewer. It was super dangerous. And so all of these chances for them to be taken advantage of by exploitative bosses, or to meet with a tragic accident in the line of work, or to be victims of organized criminal syndicates who prey upon immigrants, or to decide that they're kind of tired of being a dad to 6 kids back in Italy and to run off with another one. I mean, these are all possibilities. Yes. I mean, this is the thing about those stories. All we know is that we're in this room because our parents survived the process, and among us are not our cousins whose parents somehow got lost along the way. And so we all have these family trees where a branch has been severed, and a lot of us are looking. And so that little kernel started to turn for me, and I was like, this is a crime novel, right? This is this question of what happened to that lost immigrant man. And I'll just tell you very briefly the story from my life. So I have my son, who Kelly has met. I gave him, his middle name is Serafino. He's named after my grandfather, my mom's dad, who I just adored. My grandfather, Serafino, lovely man. I dedicated my first book to him. Adored him. In turn, I learned Serafino was named after his uncle, his father's older brother, who tragically died in a mining accident in West Virginia in 1907. So my grandfather was born in 1921. It was an homage to this lost uncle. So he had gone over to West Virginia, gotten a job in the coal mines. He was only 17 years old. There were explosions. It was really sad. So, alas, when I was doing this research, I met a genealogist who had put together, just for fun, a whole packet of clippings from newspapers in this West Virginia county from 1907. He's like, hey, did you know what really happened to your great uncle? And they had spelled one letter of the last name incorrectly, which was maybe why this never came to light. But my great great uncle did not die in a mine accident. He was in fact murdered. He was shot in the head by his best friend. He lived with this man, his best friend, as the newspaper said, who was 26 and he was 17. And the first newspaper article says that it was a crime of passion because he found out that his lodger had been sleeping with his wife. But let's think about it. I mean, these are like surrogate parents who are almost a generation older than him, right? I mean, maybe it's possible. But then the second article that came out, the friend is arraigned. He's put in the local lockup for trial. He's completely heartbroken for having killed his best friend, so he commits suicide. Very suspiciously, he commits suicide by hanging himself with a belt that had been taken away from him before he was locked up. Yes. And the judge who tried this case, very famous in this year, in 1907, for breaking up black hand syndicates in this county. He was the one who cracked down and finally got the black hand that was, this chokehold on the Italian American community. He got them busted and started putting them away. I think the subtext that there was organized criminal involvement is really clear. It's right there. So what do we know about my great uncle? He was a victim of the mob. He was in the mob. I don't know. I don't know. But the point is, my son has his name. Like, this is like when these say that trauma takes 4 generations to work its way out of a family, right? So I mean, if we made it one more generation, maybe everyone would have forgotten. But now I'm like, these questions, they begged a mystery novel. So I was like, that's what I'm gonna do. So I should have told you what the book is about in the first place. It's set in 1960. It's about an American woman in this tiny village in Calabria who starts meddling, looking into the whereabouts of missing immigrant men when an unidentified corpse appears after a flood in the village piazza. So that's a much longer answer than you wanted to your question.
So I feel like your first book was more of a family story.
Yeah.
This one's more of a mystery. Your background as an editor, Soho, where she is the editorial director, is a crime and mystery publisher, and 90% of the books are mystery and thriller. How did you find it harder or easier to tell a story with a mystery based on your background and also based on what you were trying to do with the story?
Yeah.
First, I want to say the stakes were really high because I thought if I mess this up, I lose all of my credibility in the industry. So I knew that, and I put it aside several times because of it. That I had the idea for this a long time ago, and then I was like, no, can't touch it. And then finally, I was like, I'm going to try. If I haven't studied the form closely enough for my full-time job for the last 15 years, thinking about how mysteries work and what works, and I don't read them casually, you know. I like, if I haven't gleaned enough by now, I probably never will. So I took a crack at it, and it was a lot of work. So I wanted to make a really tricky mystery. I really wanted to reward, I hope historical fiction readers will get enough out of it. They won't even have to care about the plot if that's not what they're looking for. But for the real, true, like, dyed-in-the-wool mystery readers, I wanted to give them a tricky plot where they could be like, ooh, Golden Age style puzzle. So that was really hard to make it all work. It was so worth the effort. It was so much fun. And figuring out where the red herrings would be and who the suspects are, and making sure you've developed believable suspects even when they're not the ones. These are the flaws that I know happen in mystery novels. Usually that the suspects, the red herrings, are explored thoroughly and the real culprits are kind of left underexplored, and then it's all these ways that I've been disappointed through mystery reads myself. I'm like, can't do that. So I worked it really hard, but it was fun the whole time. It was really fun work.
That's a really good point, because we do read a lot of mysteries at the store. We've had a couple at book club. Most of the time, at the end of a mystery, there's only 2 ways that a mystery will end.
Yeah.
Really, really well.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
it's like they throw everything but the kitchen sink in the end.
Yeah.
And yours is done really well. And I think it's because you know what makes a good mystery novel. And I think it's hard sometimes we get it that the author's trying to, trick you and
Yeah.
not make you figure out the ending, but sometimes you're just like, whoa, what is happening? Why are there so many words? So I think it was important the way you did it. And we read Frozen River recently. Have you read that?
No.
And I think it's similar in that the mystery is kind of secondary, because really you're just learning so much about the culture and the whole thing.
One of the things that's most fascinating about crime fiction to me, it's not the crime itself. Like, you have a dead body, someone was guilty, that's kind of cut and dry. But it's really interesting to watch how crime takes an effect on the community where it happens. So whenever I'm reading, like, even a very dull or cliche murder mystery core to a book can be a really well done novel if you're in the minds of the characters, if you're in the time and place where it's set, if it brings that to life for you, because our jurisprudence really changes. Every microculture has its way of dealing with crime. That was super interesting here, because we're in an area where there's no governmental interference, there's no law enforcement, there's endemic mafia, and there are social rules that are 1,000 years old that are sometimes stronger than the pursuit of life, And so that was really interesting to work inside, so thank you for saying that. But I also, knowing what I do about the genre, I followed some rules. So I love fair play. Fair play is like a rule that was established or kind of codified in the 1920s when Golden Age detective fiction came about. And there are these things you should not do to to fool your reader, right? It's not fair if you get to the end and it turns out your narrator was withholding information. So there has to be, if they're reading closely, they can follow the mystery. If you have not given them enough information to do that, then you're not playing by fair play rules. There's 10 rules total, and they're a little antiquated, so I won't quote all of them. But things like the evil twin is a no-no. Supernatural interference. These are all ways that are not fair to the reader, right? So I wanted to do that. I wanted to make it tricky, but I gave you the clues, and so if you get to the end and you've solved it, I hope you feel an incredible sense of satisfaction. And if you haven't solved it at the end, then I really hope it makes you turn around and want to look at it again.
That's very good.
That's very good, and I like that because we've read some books here where we're like, okay, that's cheating.
Yeah.
It's like
Totally.
this weird, like something that would never actually happen. Like that shouldn't count.
Yeah.
So I appreciate when there's like a respect for the reader and for the time they're putting into this book and that kind of thing. So another question I have is, or something that your books have made me think about more than any other books really, is that you always think about the immigration story, like when the person gets to where they're going and what happens to them there.
Yeah.
Very seldom do we ever think about what they left behind and what the consequences are for all the people leaving these areas, no matter where they are. And I think you're really good at that. And I think it's interesting to me how my grandparents came from Italy too, and all we think about is when they got here, and we think about very rarely do you think about where they left. And so, interestingly, Italy seems like so many people have left that they maybe still haven't caught up completely. So when you're researching this novel and you were there and that kind of thing, how different is it actually when you're in these? I don't want to use the word like open corruption. I can't think of another way to say it. But how easy is that to recognize in a place like that?
Yeah.
So the Italian diaspora is one of the extreme diasporas in human history, right? There have been a few like this where cultural and just political and social pressures just led to a country being evacuated. So we have some that are going on right now that are analogous. I think that the modern diaspora that you can really compare is the Philippine diaspora. There's a lot culturally in common there where people loved their homeland and they were leaving to work, and the intention was always to maintain these ties and to go back. But the sheer number of labor, people able to labor, right, in that age group who are not laboring in the country where they were born, it's a huge majority, right? So, and in Italy, this kicked off with unification in 1861. And there was an Italian identity that was imposed on the whole peninsula of Italy, which had not been Italian up until then, right? Like my people were Calabrese or Molisani, they weren't Abruzzesi, and there were city-states, there were local governments, there was the Kingdom of Naples, which was a big colonial empire, but there was not Italian identity, and there was a lot of feudalism, entrenched feudalism, so people were told they weren't allowed to leave their villages. They had to labor for the person who owned the land in their village. Even long after feudalism was banished in early 1800s, there's no way the villagers knew that it had been banished. They were protected from that information. They were protected from learning to read. They had those schools. I mean, it was a tough scenario. So then in 1860, when Italy unifies, and suddenly everyone is Italian, everyone has a passport, and everyone has a chance to be something besides from their village and working, barely able to make enough money to pay for the medicine for their children, which is just really hard. And so then they start leaving. They go other places to seek labor, and the exodus was so massive at that moment. And so what has happened, to your point, is when you walk through these villages in southern Italy, they're empty. there are abandoned houses. There was this clearly intentionality to come home, but then you start a life in America, and you're living and working here, and then the wars happen, and it's safer if you bring your family over, and we lose these connections. But there's still this double-sided yearning. You know, we want to know where we were from, and the people who were left behind, or their great-great-grandchildren, have this idea that that empty house on the hill was, you know, once owned by my aunt, and maybe they're coming home someday. It's really, it's heartbreaking to see, and also it's something that is worth interrogating, because there was, in those, there's so much, that path was so dangerous for immigrants. And when we now have clearer ways of talking about what organized crime is, you know, we have named the Calabrian mob, it's the 'Ndrangheta, we've named the Sicilian mob, Cosa Nostra, etc. But in the years around 1900, this is like what I think of as the lost generation, you know, touching on in this book, but they haven't put names on them. We were still in the phase where organized crime was a concept that wasn't really being written about. Journalists who knew about it were afraid to write about it. The Italian state was not yet cracking down on it. And you have these systems where the local baron, who's no longer a baron, because, you know, the feudal form has been banished, but he still owns this land that's been in his family, and he still wants these peasants to work for him. He still has all the money in control there. So he will designate a padrone, you know, a guy, an agent, who is going to make sure that any money that changes hands, or labor that leaves the village, or whatever, that it's going to happen through his control. And so any of us here who are descended from Italians, we have been touched by organized crime. Like, certainly your relatives purchased a visa and a work contract that came through a mafioso. Like, that happened. They were the only legal channels because of the relationships that they had set up. And so, you know, once you have this association, maybe you clear it after that. You get here and you work and you have no more association with organized crime. But probably not. Like, say you want to open a business, right? And you're going to open a bakery because your family bakes bread. And in this new town in America, if you don't want your bakery to be bombed every Thursday morning, you have to pay protection to this Black Hand Syndicate that's there, and they're going to protect you from the rest of the bad guys out there. So all of us Italians are touched by organized crime, and we don't want to acknowledge it or talk about it because we've tried to get away from that reputation. And it's really sticky. It's not written about. I know there are Italian American publications that will not cover this book because they refuse to publish any book that, that contains the word mafia in association with Italian American identity. These are, but I think that if we don't talk about it, we're not honoring what our forebears went through. We're not honoring the people who were brave enough to stand up to the corruption and to these structures, or to live uncomfortable lives where they didn't take advantage of those shapes, you know, and the honorable men, and not the men of honor, but the honorable men and the honorable women in our forebears who did fight back or somehow resisted and left. Their stories need to be told, and you can't do it without talking about what they were fighting back against.
I think that tell me if I'm wrong, I think our grandfather shortened my mom's last name because he was going into business and didn't want to be associated with like corruption and that kind of thing. So we actually changed the last name because it was a pretty big deal. No, but it makes sense. Now because that was so interesting. I was going to ask you that. Now, when you went to Italy the first time to do the research for your first book, I feel like I remember you. I'm cheating because I know you for so long, but I feel like I remember you telling a story that sparked the interest of this book when you were there.
Yeah.
And I remember in the room everybody being like, "Why did you do that?"
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. I love this story, and I really want you to tell it again. And everyone in the room, we're supposed to be listening to the book she was talking about. I don't think you were talking about this book yet. You couldn't possibly have been. But we were like, "Why did you do that? Are you crazy?" So why don't you tell that story? Because it's fun.
So there are a couple candidates for the story you have in mind, but are you talking about the time I went to visit the ghost town of Africa?
Yes.
I knew, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was true. So it was 2017. I had finished writing Stella, but it hadn't come out yet. I had an agent, and she was going to be going out on submission that fall. But she's like, in the meantime, distract yourself, start working on your new project. And I had this idea of this story about the lost immigrant men and, you know, building a mystery novel. I had that already. But I hadn't decided where exactly I was going to set it. And the other thing that happened was my mother, my Calabrian mother, she had gone to Calabria once, for one day. So we had, our other side of the family is from what is now Molise, and she loved it there. She would always go visit that village every summer. She was briefly engaged to a guy there, or at least he thought they were engaged, whatever, that's a different story. But the one time she tried to make a trip to her mother's village, she got there, it was 1971, and there was no running water in the village, there was no electricity. Everyone came up to her with like little vats of aperitivo, like really strong liquor or really strong coffee, and she was, and they killed a goat, and then they expected her to eat it, and that was traumatizing. And then she's like, I really have to do my laundry, and her great aunt was like, oh, okay, come with me, and showed her how to like wash her underwear against the stones in the creek, and she's like, I'm out of here, like dirt roads. Like, I understand why my mother left. That was her impression. And it's true, up to 1970, there were still villages that had not yet been served by the state. That's a lot of what this book is about, how slow the state was to really, catch up and like make some of these humanitarian necessities happen for its poorest people, which was everybody. So the Italian state, not so efficient. That's the punchline. So that was her impression of Calabria, and of course I'd gone on 2 research trips. I was obsessed with it. I was like, Mom, you've got to go on a road trip with me. So I talked her into it, and we had an amazing time, and we drove all over, and I was surveying these different parts of Calabria for where I wanted to set this. And I had recently become completely obsessed with this ghost town called Africo. It's like Africa, but with an O at the end. And Africo was the most remote, secluded town in the heart of the Aspromonte Massif, which is the southernmost mountains in Calabria. And there are a lot of sort of beautiful cities around the fringe. Africo was in the middle. So instead of like Mediterranean views and lemon trees, it was like pine and holm oak forests. And this is where the 'Ndrangheta was born, the Calabrian mob. So when you think of John Paul Getty, when he was kidnapped and they couldn't find him for 5 months because the forest was so dense, that's the area we're talking about. So Africo was deep in the mountains at altitude of 1,800 feet or meters or whatever. Sorry, meters, yes. And so secluded, no road connecting it to any other town. Basically, an island in the trees. You had to like walk for 6 hours down this cliff face. So and they had no doctor. So if you needed a doctor, like the famous story is the woman in labor and it's not going well. So she is strapped to a pallet, and 6 men have to scale this cliff face to get her to the closest doctor. I mean, very, very dramatic lifestyle. No running water, no electricity, no etc. And it sort of in the middle of the century became an outrage platform because of that. Like a famous philanthropist went there and was like, these people need help. So then it was forcibly abandoned in 1950. And there was a flood that knocked over some buildings. It's described as a catastrophic flood, but in fact, only 7 people were killed. I mean, it's terrible for a village of 4,000, but it wasn't like it destroyed the village, which is what people said happened. But the state used this as an invitation. They were like, it's too dangerous where you live. We can't protect you up there. You're too remote. Why don't you come down to the seaside, the coast, where you can have prefab houses and electricity and running water, and you can have access to the railroads. You can get a job. It will be great. You'll have a whole new lifestyle. And so the village voted to do that. But 1950. So shockingly, the Italian government had nowhere to put these people when they evacuated them. So they put them in refugee camps on the side of the road outside of Reggio, the big city. And they said, oh, we're working on your city. Guess when they got their city together? 1961. So 11 years living in these like corrugated tin roof hut refugee encampments. So what happens during that time? 20% of the population dies. All the old folks who've never been exposed to malaria, they're eating fish. They've never seen a fish before. For 1,000 years that people have farmed goats. That's not, they don't even eat pasta up there. They eat lentils because they don't have wheat. And then, the rest, the working age population, they don't have documents or an address that lets them get legal jobs. So they either emigrate or they join the mob. And so shortly after to this day, the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses of the 'Ndrangheta, is a guy named Giuseppe Morabido, and he was born in Africa. He's like 86 years old now. But it was total cultural apocalypse. And I was obsessed with it. I was just obsessed. I was like, I need to see Africa. I need to understand what went wrong there. I want to see it with my own eyes. So I did talk. I reached out to a total stranger. He's a very nice man, and we're dear friends now. He's an author who was born in Africa, and he's now a lawyer in Milan. Well, he's a full-time writer, but he had been a lawyer in Milan. And he'd written a book about the Aspromonte and growing up in Africa. I reached out to him, and he wrote back and offered me a tour with him. So all the stars were aligning. I was there with my mother. He emailed me and said, just call me. I'll pick you up and I'll take you on a tour. And I'm like, I don't know this guy. Is this really a good idea? And so he came and he picked me and my mother up in his fancy car, and he drove us out to his cousin's beachside resort, where we had this beautiful fish dinner that he insisted on treating us to. And so we got to know him, and very nice, just a nice gentleman. And my mother, who is embarrassed of her Italian accent because of her dialect, she just sat there silently the whole time. And the men referred to her as La Dolce Signora, the sweet lady, which goes to show they knew nothing about my mother. My husband was like, it's probably a preventative. These are Calabrian men. They know that if a woman is sitting there silently, call her the sweet lady. She's definitely a sweet lady. So we had a great time with them. We liked them very much. We made an agreement that the next day he was going to drive me up to the mountains. He says, some friends of mine, some cousins and friends of mine are taking a trip up there. I'll take you on a hike. I'll show you the center of Old Africa. I couldn't go any other way because the city has got barbed wire fencing around it. It's closed off. So if you have a guided tour from a government designated hiker, you can go up there. But the hike is like, I'm not a hiker. So I was like 7 hours each way. I wasn't going to, I would have tried to see it, but here was my free pass. We were going to go up in, 4-wheel drive over these broken roads. Okay, what's going to happen to my mom? Well, so she doesn't want to go up into the jungle because she's afraid of snakes. They're like, oh, there are no snakes up there. No, she's not having any of it. They're like, we have an idea. We'll bring you to this beachside resort. You can bob around in the ocean, and then, we'll reunite you at the end of the day. So we're like, okay. They tell me to meet them at this roadside cafe at 5 a.m. They're like, we're getting an early start. It's a 3 hours drive up the mountain. Okay. So the next morning, my mom drops me off at this cafe. The sun is like not up yet. It's like the sky is kind of orange around the edge. And this white van drives up, and out hop 5 men. 5 men, yeah, 5 men. And they're all, I would say in their 40s, kind of rough shaven. My friend, my now friend is there. Obviously, I survived this story. And my mom's like, bye. And I'm like, bye, Mom. And we get in the van and we go driving up this gorge through these mountains and climbing up this, crazy precipice to this mafia home nest that has been forcibly abandoned. And when we get there, it's incredible. My mom later is like, oh, that never would have happened in the 70s. I'm like, I don't know what should have happened now, but it did. So we get there and they have a key magically to unlock the barbed wire gate. I was like, oh, so you're here legally? And they're like, yeah, more or less. That was my favorite line. More or less. Okay, we get there and they're working on rebuilding this city. They've reclaimed. They're like, my grandparents owned this house, therefore it's my house. No one else owns this, right? This should still be our land. And they had built this sort of barrack there that had electricity, they had a generator, they had running water. And so a couple of the guys, one of them stops and he leaves us there because he starts cooking. It's 9 o'clock in the morning at this point. And the rest of us go on this hike 2 hours down into this ancient center of the city, all stone, collapsed stone and brambles coming out of the roofs, and this untouched church right in the middle of town. And meanwhile, through the piazza are wandering these feral cows with these huge horns, and they're all skinny and they're dining. I know, right? And we find a giant femur like this in the rocks as we're walking. And they're like, "Oh, the cows are clumsy. They're always falling off the mountains." I'm like, "Am I gonna fall off the mountains? I don't know." And we passed the other thing that was kind of spooky to me. These giant pigs. They weren't pigs. They're half boar, half pig. So when the people were forced to leave, they left their pigs behind, and they mated with the mountain boars. And so just all this random wildlife. And so they tell me these stories as we're walking, and I won't tell you, the story's already long, so I'll say you can get the rest out of the book. But I just learned so much that day, and the sun was so bright. I had so much 100-proof sunscreen on, and I just felt it. You're so close to the sun in this dense forest, and it was really sort of almost hallucinatory experience. And we get back to the camp to have a huge lunch, a 4-course lunch that this one little guy, Pasquale, has cooked. And there are 26 people there. And I am the only woman. And there's some of them are in like the, full military, like not military, but like paramilitary garb. And they're sort of gangster haircuts, the high and tights, and they're tattooed. And I'm looking around and I'm like, what? I started to get nervous. That's when I started to get nervous. I was like, well, I can't drive. I don't know where I am. There's no Uber coming for me. Anyway.
But there's lunch.
There was lunch. It was delicious. So I made the best of it. I'm like, this is what being a writer is. It's being open to experience, possibly dying, but if not, writing about it afterward. And so at a certain point in the afternoon, the lunch was over, and they walked off the wine a little bit, and then a couple of them returned. They got me in the car. They're like, "Oh, we got to get you to your mom before it gets too late. She's been bobbing around in the ocean for all these hours." So we head down the mountain. I pick my mom up. We thank them. We go home. It's all safe. So when I get home, of course, we were staying at what's called an agriturismo. It's a farm, a working farm that will also have sort of hotel clients, but they're usually pretty rustic and beautiful. But anyway, they did not have internet. So I hadn't been able to do any of my usual snooping, right? So when I get home and I have internet access, I'm Googling, and I find that my generous friend, who is still my friend, and I thanked him in the book, and he's really sort of the godfather of this book. So his name is Joaquino Criaco, and he's an author. So I look him up, and his Wikipedia page links to, known relatives, and I click through his brother, Pietro Criaco, who has the byline, the corpse kisser. So he was a hitman for the Ndrangheta. Yep, he was on Interpol's top 10 most wanted list for 13 years while he was on the lam. He's in prison now. He was captured when he was living in a closet out in the kitchen of the very nice cousin at whose resort my mother was bobbing in the ocean of. Very nice cousin who had done 2 years in jail for assistance there, and it goes, there were more stories, but I was like, that is what I wanted to capture, and as he said to me, Joaquino, he said, the thing is that none of us have clean hands, right? We were born here. What we can do is we can try to make sure that our children can have clean hands and make the decisions that don't perpetuate this violence, that this generational violence that we were born into. And so that was a source of inspiration. That was a very long story. Thank you all for your patience.
Great.
You can imagine the room. She told that story the first time. I think there were like 50 people in the room, and literally no one made a sound. And we were like, "What did you just say?" And I will say, you said it like it was like, "Well, I was doing some research and we were like, what is she saying?" So she made it a whole live, thank God. So when, I'll let you guys ask questions now, because that's a great, the reason why that is a great way to end is because you can say this, like this morning somebody was asking me what the book was about, and I said, well, it's a mystery set in Italy, and there's all this corruption, and I'm like, there's really no way to describe the amount of work and effort that is behind the writing of this book. Because sometimes you say, and I don't mean this in derogatory way at all, but when people are looking for like genre fiction, like a romance or a mystery, you can hand somebody something that's very rote. It's like, okay, this is what's going to happen. It's a mystery. Da, 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 da. I mean, obviously, your books are not like that. The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna was not like that. This is not like that. The amount of respect you have for the story you're telling is actually the important part of your books.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's the highest compliment.
So I think that it's like, you can't, this is not like this is a mystery. This is like, no, this is the story of why so many people in the world are the way that they are. And this is just like one little glimpse of it. And I really respect the way you do it. So, does anybody want to ask Juliet a question?
Isn't that crazy?
And was your mom mad at you?
No.
Yeah, what was her day like?
She had a great time at the beach. Yeah, we laughed about this a lot. We've laughed about this a lot. That's our sense of humor, Italians.
What did she say when you tell her? I'm sure you told her fully what your day was all about. What did she say? What was her reaction?
That wouldn't have happened in the 70s.
That's what she said. Okay.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
we had some.
I mean, yeah, the fact that it took you that long to get nervous, still to this day, I'm
Yeah.
like, what?
Now, what year did you go there? 2017.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
for the first time. I've been back, so I went back in 2019, right before the pandemic. It was, good timing.
I had obviously, like, not necessarily all of the readership of this book is going to be as aware of Calabrian history and sort of more broadly Italian history. So what was it a challenge to kind of figure out, like, okay, what is the average reader coming into this book going to know? What do I have to explain? What don't I have to explain? What do I let them discover for themselves?
Yeah.
That is such a great question. My husband the other day, he said, "Oh, somehow," when I was doing an event, he's like, "Somehow you managed to be both pedantic and funny," and I was like, "I'm comfortable if that's my brand. That's fine. I have so much information about Calabria and I want to share it, and I'm assuming." 2 things. One, I'm assuming the reader probably has a very low level of familiarity because the information is largely not available, even to people who seek it out. But 2, I'm assuming that the reader is willing to fight for the gems that the book has to offer. I'm not a person who believes. I think a lot of mainstream publishing talks down to readers and thinks that they're not going to tolerate discomfort or they're not going to tolerate learning new things. And I just don't feel that way. I don't read that way. So it's, I've dished out what I wanted to. I hope there isn't a lot of lecturing in it. I think sometimes the reader they won't know a word. And that's okay. I hope that the experience around the word and the context for it will give them a feeling. Because here's the thing. When I was in Calabria, I didn't always understand 100% of what was going on. Even if I understood all the words, there's subtext there. I've got a main character she's a foreigner and she's walking through this space, this unfamiliar space, and she's trying as hard as I am to get to know it and to learn about it. So, I hope I struck a good balance there. I didn't, another editor would have made me cut a lot of the discursive stuff that I put in, but this book is for readers who want to know that. If you want a fast-paced thriller, you're gonna throw this book across the room. So it's not for you, but if you want the trivia and that's fun for you, then I hope you'll find a lot of richness there. So thanks. That's a great question.
And as an insider person, like Knopf publishing a mystery is rare, so you know that it's like, oh, this is not just a regular old mystery. I mean, there's no way to say it really if you don't know Knopf, but they don't publish just anything. It's, I guess, the lightest way to say it, especially if we're being recorded. So, congratulations, Juliet. Anybody else want to ask anything?
Yeah, you mentioned the Italian American organizations that won't write about it.
Yeah.
Did that make you a little bit nervous?
Was I nervous?
Well, like, you've been
Doesn't
threatened
sound
or
like much
anything.
makes you nervous.
So no,
Obviously not.
I did. So during the writing process, I felt nervous about this material, to some degree because I certainly don't want to cross paths with actual Ndrangheta members. That is not of interest to me. Those are not nice people. And even so, the ones that I dined with, those are mostly older representatives who were born into these families. But the people who are active members. I mean, they run the cartels out of Colombia. They are ruthless. They are, if you want a really good, my book is set in 1960, and I didn't go for the most ruthless treatment of this material because I wrote it during the pandemic. I wanted joy and adventure in this, and I wanted to look at the immigrant experience. But if you want to know the really dirty, dark side of the Ndrangheta, Alex Perry, The Good Mothers. That is fantastic book from, I don't know, 2018 or 2019. He's a journalist, and it's 3 Ndrangheta wives, all 3 of whom were married into these clans at 13 or 14. Then, they have children saddled to the organization by their children, who all 3 of them tried to get out, and what happened. And then the female judge who tried to help them get out. Fantastic read, very dark. I didn't want anything to do with actual present day gangsters. 1, 2. I interviewed a lot of people for this book as well, living people who've been in this part of the world, who have connections to it, and even if they're not involved, they know people who are. I didn't want to hurt any of them, and so I did some self-censoring of the material as I was writing. It's a reason that I set this book in Santa Chionia, which is a place that does not exist. So it's geographically located among 3 towns that are real. But I made up a place, I made up its history, I used names that are sourced, they're, drawn from those 3 communities. I didn't want anyone looking at these murders and the other non-murder crimes that happen in this, all of which were inspired by real material that I found, and pointing a finger at living people and being like, oh, this is that person's story. So I did a lot of self-censorship along the way with the writing, and I don't have any anxiety at all now. Now that the book is out, like I don't think anyone's going to be upset by it. Except these Italian American clubs who, and it's not all of them, but there are some of them. Like I know one publication that reviewed Stella that will not review this book, but that's fine. If they don't want to deal with this history, that's okay too. So.
Oh, thank you, Juliet.
Thank you guys so much.
If anybody would like Juliet to sign their book, Jill.
I'll go get my
Oh, I
pen.
did, and I told her you were coming, that you were ready to tell us.
Oh.